What happens when a single whisper in the darkness can change everything? When forbidden words carry the weight of life and death? Tonight, we dive into a story that will make your heart race and question everything you thought you knew about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. Subscribe now for more incredible stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The year was 1858, and the Whitmore plantation stretched across the rolling hills of Virginia like a kingdom built on suffering. The main house stood proud and imposing, its white columns gleaming under the moonlight, while the slave quarters huddled in the shadows like forgotten prayers. Thomas had lived his entire 19 years within these boundaries, knowing nothing beyond the cotton fields and the weight of chains that bound not just his body, but his dreams. His calloused hands told the story of countless dawns spent picking cotton, his scarred back a map of punishments for imagined defiances. The whip marks formed a constellation of cruelty across his dark skin, each one a reminder of Master Whitmore's absolute authority over every aspect of his existence. Born into bondage, Thomas had never known his parents. They had been sold when he was barely walking, leaving him and his sister Sarah to be raised by the community of enslaved people who became their family. Mama Ruth, the head cook, had been like a mother to them both, teaching them the unspoken rules of survival. Keep your head down, work hard, never look a white person directly in the eyes, and above all, never give them reason to notice you. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air itself seemed to whisper of change. Master Jonathan Whitmore ruled his domain with an iron fist wrapped in southern gentility. A man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and cold blue eyes, he had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it into one of the most profitable operations in Virginia. His wealth came from the labor of over 200 enslaved people, each one catalogued in his ledgers with their monetary value carefully calculated. To Whitmore, they were not human beings, but investments, assets to be bought, sold, and worked until they broke. His wife, Margaret, floated through the house like a ghost in silk, her laudanum-dulled eyes seeing nothing beyond her own reflection. Once a belle of Richmond society, she had retreated into a haze of medication and melancholy after losing 3 children in infancy. The only child who survived was Isabella, and Margaret's maternal instincts had been so damaged by grief that she barely acknowledged her daughter's existence. And then there was Isabella, their 17-year-old daughter, whose emerald eyes held secrets that could burn down everything her father had built. Unlike other girls of her station, Isabella possessed a sharp intellect and an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the plantation's borders. She had been educated by a series of tutors, some of whom had inadvertently exposed her to ideas that challenged everything her society held sacred. Isabella had always been different. While other plantation daughters concerned themselves with embroidery and marriage prospects, she spent her time reading forbidden books hidden beneath her mattress, stories of abolitionists, accounts of the Underground Railroad, words that could get a person hanged in Virginia. She had discovered these books in her grandfather's library, hidden behind volumes of poetry and philosophy. Her grandfather, she had learned from old letters, had harbored secret doubts about slavery, though he had never acted on them. The house settled into its nightly rhythm. Master Whitmore retired to his study with his bourbon and ledgers, counting profits made from human misery. The study was his sanctuary, filled with maps of his property, contracts for slave purchases, and correspondence with other plantation owners about the peculiar institution that formed the backbone of their economy. Tonight, he was particularly pleased. The cotton harvest had exceeded expectations, and the sale of several slaves had brought in substantial revenue. Margaret had long since succumbed to her evening dose of medicine, administered by her personal maid, who had learned to measure the exact amount needed to ensure her mistress slept through the night without incident. The servants moved like shadows, completing their final tasks before retreating to their quarters, where they would whisper prayers for deliverance and share stories of freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. Thomas was finishing his work in the stables when he heard the soft rustle of silk behind him. The stables were his domain, where he cared for the plantation's horses with a skill that even Master Whitmore grudgingly acknowledged. Thomas had a way with animals, a gentleness that calmed even the most spirited stallions. It was here, among the horses, that he felt closest to something resembling peace. He turned, expecting to see one of the house servants, but instead found himself face to face with Isabella Whitmore herself. She wore a dark cloak over her nightgown, her golden hair braided loosely down her back. Her feet were bare, and Thomas noticed she had taken care to avoid the gravel paths that would announce her presence. She shouldn't be here. The rules were clear. Slaves and the master's family maintained strict boundaries. The punishment for a slave found alone with a white woman, especially the master's daughter, was swift and brutal. Thomas had seen men hanged for less. Yet here she stood, her green eyes burning with an intensity that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, dropping his gaze to the ground as he'd been taught. "You shouldn't look at me, Thomas." Her voice was soft but commanding, carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her privileged upbringing. Against every instinct screaming danger, he raised his eyes to meet hers. In the lamplight, he could see that her face was pale but determined, her jaw set with a resolve that reminded him of his sister Sarah when she'd made up her mind about something. "I know what my father plans," she said, her words barely audible above the night sounds of crickets and distant owls. "Tomorrow, he's selling you to the Hendersons down in Georgia. You'll never see your sister again." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The Hendersons were known throughout Virginia for their brutal treatment of slaves. Their rice plantations in the Georgia lowlands were considered a death sentence. The work was backbreaking, the climate deadly, and few slaves survived more than a few years in the swamps. Sarah, his little sister, only 14, working in the main house, she was all the family he had left in this world. "But there's another way," Isabella continued, stepping closer. The scent of jasmine from her perfume mixed with the hay and leather of the stable, creating an incongruous blend of luxury and earthiness. "When all the lights go out, my window will be open." Time stopped. Thomas felt his entire world shift on its axis. Those 9 words carried the weight of revolution, of hope, of certain death if they were caught. The implications crashed over him like a wave. She was offering him escape, freedom, a chance to run north to the territories where slavery was forbidden. He froze, his mind racing through the implications. Was this a test, a trap set by Master Whitmore to justify even harsher punishments? Thomas had heard stories of masters who used such tricks to identify potential runaways, marking them for sale or worse. Or was this young woman, raised in privilege and comfort, truly offering him a chance at the impossible, freedom? Isabella's hand moved slightly, and Thomas saw a small piece of paper tucked between her fingers. "There's a map," she whispered. "Routes north, safe houses, people who will help." Why? The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, a question that encompassed everything. Why risk her safety? Why help him? Why challenge the very foundations of the world that had given her everything? For a moment, Isabella's composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and desperate beneath. Her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall, and Thomas saw in her face the weight of secrets and moral struggles that had been eating at her soul. "Because I've read their letters, Thomas. I've seen the bills of sale with your name on them. I've watched my father count money earned from your blood and sweat. I've heard him discuss you like your livestock, planning your future without any regard for your humanity. And I won't be part of this anymore." The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made them both freeze. Isabella quickly stepped back into the shadows as one of the overseers made his rounds, lanterns swinging lazily in the darkness. The man was drunk. Thomas could tell from his unsteady gait, but his presence was still dangerous. They waited, hearts pounding, until the footsteps faded into the distance. When the danger passed, Isabella emerged from the shadows and pressed the paper into Thomas's hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but her voice remained steady. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, "when the house is dark and everyone sleeps. My window faces the oak tree. You can climb up using the branches. I'll have everything you need." Then she was gone, melting back into the darkness as silently as she had appeared, leaving only the faint scent of jasmine and a piece of paper that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Thomas's trembling hand. Back in his quarters, Thomas lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden planks. Around him, Other slaves slept the exhausted sleep of the broken, men and women who had worked from dawn to dusk in the cotton fields, their bodies pushed to the limits of human endurance. But rest eluded him. The paper burned against his chest where he'd hidden it, and Isabella's words echoed in his mind. "When all the lights go out, my window will be open." He thought of Sarah, of her gentle smile, and the way she hummed while she worked in the main house. She had their mother's voice, though neither of them remembered their mother's face. He thought of the stories whispered in the quarters about slaves who had tried to run, some who made it north to freedom, others who were caught and made examples of in ways that haunted the nightmares of those left behind. As the night deepened and the plantation settled into silence, Thomas made his choice. Tomorrow night, when darkness fell and the house slept, he would discover whether Isabella Whitmore was his salvation or his doom. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, separation from Sarah and a slow death in the Georgia rice fields, was worse than any punishment he could imagine. He closed his eyes and tried to picture freedom, tried to imagine a world where he could walk where he pleased, work for wages, and call his soul his own. It was a dream so distant it seemed like fantasy, but Isabella's whispered promise had made it feel, for the first time in his life, like a possibility. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas worked in the fields under the scorching Virginia sun, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of cotton picking while his mind raced with possibilities and fears. The cotton bolls seemed heavier today, each one a reminder of the bondage he might soon escape, or die trying to leave behind. The overseer, a cruel man named Briggs with a face weathered by years of hatred and whiskey, rode his horse along the rows of workers, his whip coiled and ready. Thomas kept his head down, his movements steady and unremarkable, but inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Every glance from Briggs felt like suspicion. Every casual conversation with fellow slaves seemed fraught with danger. The paper hidden in his quarters felt like a beacon that surely everyone could see. During the brief rest period at midday, when the slaves gathered under the sparse shade of a lone oak tree to share water and catch their breath, Thomas found himself studying the faces around him. These were his people, his family in all but blood. Old Moses, whose back was permanently bent from decades of labor. Young Samuel, barely 16, but already showing the hollow look of a man whose spirit was being slowly crushed. The women who worked alongside the men, their hands bleeding from the sharp cotton bowls, their voices raised in quiet spirituals that spoke of deliverance and promised lands. Would he ever see them again? If Isabella's plan succeeded, if he managed to reach the north, would he be able to help any of them? The weight of leaving them behind pressed down on him like a physical burden, but he knew that staying meant certain separation from Sarah and probable death in the Georgia swamps. Isabella moved through her day with practiced normalcy, taking breakfast with her parents in the formal dining room, where crystal glasses caught the morning light and silver serving pieces reflected the faces of the enslaved people who served the meal. She received her French tutor, Madame Dubois, a stern woman from New Orleans, who had been hired to polish Isabella's education in preparation for her eventual marriage to a suitable gentleman. But beneath the surface of these routine activities, Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. She had spent months planning this moment, studying her father's papers, memorizing the layout of safe houses and underground railroad routes, preparing for the night when she would finally act on the convictions that had been growing stronger with each passing day. The map she'd given Thomas was hand-copied from documents she'd stolen from her father's study, correspondence with other plantation owners about runaway slaves, reports from slave catchers detailing their methods and routes, and most importantly, a letter from a northern abolitionist that had somehow found its way into her father's papers. She had discovered this letter quite by accident while searching for a book in her father's private library. The letter, written in careful code, spoke of safe houses, of brave souls who risked everything to guide escaped slaves to freedom. The letter mentioned specific landmarks: a red barn with a weather vane shaped like a rooster, a church with a distinctive bell tower, a mill where the wheel turned counterclockwise. It spoke of code words and signals, quilts hung in specific patterns, lanterns placed in windows, the call of a whippoorwill answered by the hoot of an owl. Most importantly, it provided names and locations of people who could be trusted, conductors on the Underground Railroad who had dedicated their lives to the cause of human freedom. Isabella had memorized every word before burning the original, but not before copying the crucial information that now rested against Thomas's chest. She had spent weeks creating her own map, carefully noting distances, marking dangerous areas where slave catchers were known to patrol, and identifying the safest routes through the Virginia countryside. "Isabella, dear, you seem distracted today," her mother observed over lunch, her words slightly slurred from her morning laudanum dose. Margaret Whitmore sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her once beautiful face now gaunt and pale, her eyes unfocused and distant. The medicine that dulled her emotional pain also clouded her perception, making her oblivious to the tension that radiated from her daughter. "Just thinking about the church social next week, Mother," Isabella replied smoothly, cutting her ham into precise pieces she had no intention of eating. "I want everything to be perfect for our guests." The lie came easily, as lies had become necessary tools in Isabella's arsenal of deception. She had become expert at maintaining the facade of a dutiful Southern belle, while secretly harboring beliefs that would have scandalized her entire social circle. She attended church services where ministers preached that slavery was God's will, nodding politely while her soul rebelled against every word. She participated in sewing circles where ladies discussed their slaves like livestock, contributing to conversations that made her stomach turn. Master Whitmore looked up from his newspaper, the Richmond Inquirer, which carried advertisements for runaway slaves alongside notices of cotton prices and political news. "Speaking of perfection, I've finalized the sale of that boy Thomas to the Hendersons. They'll be here tomorrow afternoon to collect him and transport him to their Georgia operation. Good riddance. He's been getting too comfortable lately, asking questions about his sister's duties, showing signs of discontent." Isabella's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the quiet dining room. "Thomas? But father, he's one of our best workers. The horses respond to him better than anyone else we've had." "Precisely why he'll fetch a good price," Whitmore replied, his cold blue eyes studying his daughter's face with the calculating gaze of a man who missed nothing. "The Hendersons need strong backs for their rice fields, much harder work than cotton. The swamps and the heat will break any rebellious spirit he might be developing. Besides, I've noticed him watching the house too closely lately, paying too much attention to things that don't concern him." The casual cruelty in her father's voice made Isabella's stomach turn. She had grown up hearing such conversations, but only recently had she begun to truly understand their implications. Her father spoke of Thomas as if he were discussing the sale of a horse or a piece of farm equipment, completely indifferent to the human cost of his decision. "What about his sister?" Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice level. "Sarah works in the house. Won't she be upset by the separation?" Master Whitmore's laugh was cold and humorless. "Upset? She's property, Isabella, not family. Her feelings are irrelevant. If she becomes troublesome, we'll sell her too. There are always buyers for young house servants." Isabella excused herself from the table, claiming a headache, and retreated to her room where she could finally allow her mask to slip. She sat at her writing desk, staring out the window at the fields where Thomas labored under the brutal sun, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Meanwhile, in the fields, Thomas had learned of his impending sale through the plantation's efficient gossip network. News traveled quickly among the enslaved community, passed along in whispered conversations during brief moments when the overseers weren't watching. The confirmation of Isabella's words lent credibility to her impossible offer, but it also made the danger more immediate and real. As evening approached, Thomas sought out his sister Sarah in the main house. She was in the kitchen, helping prepare dinner under the watchful eye of Mama Ruth, the head cook who had raised half the slave children on the plantation. Mama Ruth was a woman of immense dignity and quiet strength, her grey hair always covered by a spotless head wrap, her dark eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had survived decades of bondage through intelligence and careful navigation of the plantation's complex social hierarchy. "Sarah," Thomas whispered, when he caught her alone for a moment near the pantry, I need to tell you something important." His sister's dark eyes, so like his own, filled with tears when he explained about the sale. Sarah was small for her 14 years, her hands already showing the calluses of hard work, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had inherited their mother's quick wit and their father's stubborn determination, qualities that had helped her survive in the dangerous environment of the main house. But when Thomas mentioned Isabella's offer, her expression changed to one of pure terror. "Thomas, no, she whispered urgently, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "It's too dangerous. What if it's a trap? What if they catch you? You know what Master Whitmore does to runaways." They both knew the stories. Slaves who were caught attempting escape faced punishments designed to serve as examples to others. Whippings that left permanent scars, brandings that marked them as runners, sailed to the most brutal plantations in the Deep South. Some were never seen again, their fates serving as whispered warnings in the quarters. "What if they don't catch me?" Thomas countered, his voice barely audible. "Sarah, this might be our only chance. If I can make it north, I can find work, save money, maybe even find a way to buy your freedom or help you escape too. And if you die trying?" The question hung between them like a blade. Thomas pulled his sister close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, soap and cornbread and the faint smell of the kitchen where she spent her days. He memorized the feel of her small frame in his arms, the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her presence. "Then at least I'll die trying to be free," he whispered, "and maybe someday you'll understand why I had to try." As night fell over the plantation, Isabella sat by her window, watching the lights in the main house extinguish one by one. Her father's study went dark first, the last lamp blown out after he finished reviewing his account books and correspondence. Her mother's room followed, the soft glow disappearing as her personal maid helped her prepare for another laudanum-induced sleep. Finally, the servants' quarters settled into darkness, the last conversations fading into the quiet sounds of night. Isabella had changed from her day dress into dark clothing, a simple black dress that would blend with the shadows, soft-soled shoes that would make no sound on the wooden floors. She had braided her hair tightly and covered it with a dark scarf. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. In his quarters, Thomas lay fully clothed on his mattress, listening to the breathing of the men around him. The quarters were cramped and stuffy, housing 20 men in a space meant for half that number. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the lingering odor of the day's labor. One by one, his fellow slaves settled into sleep, exhausted from another day of back-breaking labor. When he was certain everyone was asleep, Thomas rose silently and made his way to the door. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms and the distant sound of night birds calling to each other across the darkness. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by but also making concealment more difficult. The main house loomed before him, its white walls ghostly in the moonlight. Most of the windows were dark, but on the second floor one window glowed with the soft light of a single candle, Isabella's signal that she was ready, that her promise was real. As Thomas approached the house, every step felt like walking toward either salvation or damnation. The gravel crunched softly under his feet, each sound seeming loud enough to wake the dead. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He reached the base of the house and looked up. Isabella's window was directly above him, and as promised it stood open. A rope made from bedsheets hung down the side of the building, swaying gently in the night breeze. The sight of it made his knees weak with relief and terror. It was real, it was happening, there was no turning back now. At the window, Isabella's silhouette appeared. She looked down at him, and even in the darkness he could see the determination in her posture. She had kept her promise, had risked everything to give him this chance. Now came the moment of truth. Thomas grasped the makeshift rope, testing its strength. It held firm. Isabella had done her work well, tying the sheets together with knots that would support his weight. As he began to climb, Thomas thought of Sarah sleeping in the servants' quarters, of the life he was leaving behind, and of the uncertain future that awaited him in the darkness beyond the plantation's borders. Each handhold brought him closer to either freedom or death, and he found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening for the strength to see this through. The rope creaked softly as Thomas pulled himself up toward the open window, toward Isabella Whitmore, toward a choice that would change both their lives forever. Thomas's hands burned as he pulled himself up the rope, each foot of progress bringing him closer to either freedom or certain death. The makeshift ladder of bedsheets twisted slightly under his weight, and he had to fight to keep from spinning as he climbed. The night air carried the sound of his labored breathing, and he prayed it wouldn't wake the sleeping household. Below him, the ground seemed to fall away into an abyss of consequences. If he fell now, the noise would surely alert the entire plantation. When he reached Isabella's window, she helped pull him inside, her small hands surprisingly strong from years of horseback riding and outdoor activities that were considered appropriate for a young lady of her station. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the candlelit room, the magnitude of what they were doing settling between them like a living thing. The air was thick with tension and the weight of unspoken understanding. They were both crossing a line from which there could be no return. Isabella's bedroom was a world Thomas had never seen. Silk curtains in deep burgundy hung from tall windows. Polished mahogany furniture gleamed in the candlelight, and books lined the walls in neat rows that spoke of education and privilege. Paintings of distant places decorated the walls. European landscapes, exotic birds, scenes of pastoral beauty that seemed to mock the harsh reality of life just beyond these walls. But what struck him most was the small pile of supplies on her bed. A worn leather satchel, men's clothing that looked well made but not ostentatious, dried food wrapped in cloth, and a small pouch that clinked softly with coins. "You have maybe 3 hours before the morning bell," Isabella whispered, moving quickly to gather the supplies with practiced efficiency. Her movements were precise and purposeful, suggesting she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "The map shows a route through the woods to the Rappahannock River. There's a ferryman named Josiah. He's sympathetic to our cause. Tell him the mockingbird sings at midnight, and he'll know to help you." Thomas stared at her, overwhelmed by the thoroughness of her preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion. Every detail had been carefully planned, every contingency considered. "Miss Isabella, why are you doing this? If your father finds out—" "My father will never find out," she said firmly, but Thomas caught the slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her fear. "I've thought of everything. Tomorrow, when they discover you're gone, I'll be the grieving daughter. Shocked that such a thing could happen on our plantation, I'll play the part of the innocent young lady who couldn't possibly have been involved in such a scheme." She handed him the men's clothing, simple but well-made garments that would help him blend in among free blacks in the cities he'd passed through. The shirt was made of good cotton, the trousers sturdy wool that would withstand hard travel. There were also boots, worn but serviceable, that would protect his feet during the long journey ahead. "Change quickly," she instructed, turning away to give him privacy. "Every minute counts. The longer you stay here, the greater the risk for both of us." Thomas hesitated. The impropriety of changing clothes in front of a white woman, especially the master's daughter, went against everything he'd been taught about the rigid social boundaries that governed their world. But Isabella had already turned away, busying herself with the final preparations, and he realized that in this moment, such concerns seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of what they were attempting. As he changed, Isabella spoke in urgent whispers, her voice carrying the weight of months of careful planning. "Follow the North Star, but don't travel the main roads during daylight. The map shows safe houses. Look for a quilt with a log cabin pattern hanging on the line. That's the signal that the house is safe, that the people inside will help you." She pulled out a small piece of fabric, showing him the intricate pattern of squares and triangles that formed the log cabin design. "This pattern means safety, but if you see a quilt with a bear's paw pattern, it means danger. Slave catchers are in the area. A flying geese pattern means it's time to move quickly, that you need to leave immediately." "What about you?" Thomas asked, pulling on the new shirt that fit him surprisingly well. "Won't they suspect—" "Let me worry about that," Isabella cut him off. But Thomas saw the fear she was trying to hide behind her determined facade. They both knew that helping a slave escape was punishable by imprisonment, social ruin or worse. In some parts of the South, such actions were considered treason against the natural order of society. A sound from downstairs made them both freeze, the soft creak of floorboards that suggested someone was moving through the house. Isabella blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. They waited, hearts pounding as footsteps moved through the house below. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the kitchen, followed by the soft closing of a door. "Probably just Mama Ruth checking the kitchen," Isabella whispered after the sounds faded. "She sometimes can't sleep and goes to prepare things for the morning meal." In the darkness, Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This young woman, raised in privilege and comfort, was risking everything for his freedom. The magnitude of her sacrifice wasn't lost on him. She was giving up her security, her reputation, possibly her life, for a principle she believed in. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." "What you're doing, don't thank me," she replied, her voice equally emotional. "Just live. Live free, and make this worth the risk. Show the world that we were right to believe in your humanity." She pressed something into his hand, a small silver locket that felt warm from her skin. Even in the darkness, he could feel the intricate engraving on its surface. "This was my grandmother's. If you're ever in desperate need, it might buy you help or passage. It's real silver, worth enough to get you out of trouble if you're careful about how you use it." Thomas's fingers closed around the locket, feeling its weight and warmth. "I can't take this. It's a family heirloom. It must mean—" "You can and you will," Isabella said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "My grandmother would have wanted it to be used for something meaningful. She was from Boston originally before she married my grandfather. I think she would have understood what we're doing here." Isabella moved to the window, checking the grounds below with the careful attention of someone who had studied every shadow and hiding place on the plantation. "The coast is clear. You need to go now. Dawn comes early, and you need to be far from here when they discover you're gone." As Thomas prepared to climb back down, Isabella caught his arm. "Thomas, there's something else you need to know. My father has dogs, bloodhounds trained specifically for tracking runaway slaves. They'll use them to follow your scent. The map shows a creek about 2 miles north of here. Wade upstream for at least a mile to break your scent trail. The water will confuse the dogs and buy you precious time." The practical details of her planning struck Thomas anew. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion. Isabella had been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe months. She had studied the methods used by slave catchers, learned about the techniques employed by successful runaways, and planned accordingly. "There's also this," she continued, pulling a small vial from her pocket. "It's a mixture of herbs and spices, pepper, mint, other strong scents. Sprinkle it on your trail after you leave the creek. It will further confuse the dogs and make tracking you nearly impossible." "Why?" he asked again, needing to understand what drove this young woman to risk everything. "What made you decide to do this?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her silhouette framed against the window. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, filled with pain and determination in equal measure. "Because I've seen the ledgers, Thomas. I've seen how my father calculates the value of human beings like livestock. I've watched him separate families and sell children away from their mothers without a second thought. I've heard him discuss breeding programs for his slaves like they were horses or cattle. And I realize that as long as I stay silent, as long as I benefit from this system without challenging it, I'm just as guilty as he is." She moved to the window, checking the grounds below one final time. "I've been helping others escape for months now. You're not the first, and God willing, you won't be the last. There's a network of us, people who believe that slavery is wrong, that every human being deserves freedom." Thomas's eyes widened in the darkness. Isabella's assistance hadn't been a one-time act of conscience. She had been systematically helping slaves escape, right under her father's nose. The courage required for such sustained resistance was almost incomprehensible. "How many?" he whispered. "You'll be the 7th, she replied, "and everyone has made it to freedom thanks to careful planning and the help of good people along the way." The knowledge that others had successfully made this journey gave Thomas a surge of hope. If 6 others had managed to escape using Isabella's routes and methods, perhaps he could too. "The coast is clear," Isabella said, her voice now urgent. "Go now, and may God watch over you." Thomas swung his leg over the windowsill, then looked back at Isabella one last time. In the moonlight, she looked younger than her 17 years, but her eyes held a determination that belonged to someone much older, someone who had seen too much and decided to act despite the consequences. "If I make it," he whispered, "I'll find a way to send word. To let you know your sacrifice wasn't in vain. Just be free," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "That's all the thanks I need. Live the life you choose, not the one chosen for you." Thomas began his descent, the rope rough against his palms. The journey down seemed longer than the climb up, each moment stretching into eternity as he waited for a shout of alarm, for the sound of dogs barking, for the crack of a rifle. But the plantation remained silent, wrapped in the peaceful sleep of those who believed their world was secure and unchanging. When his feet touched the ground, he looked up to see Isabella's silhouette in the window. She raised her hand in a small wave, a gesture of farewell and blessing that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Then she stepped back into the darkness, leaving only the empty window and the rope that would soon be discovered. Thomas shouldered the satchel and began moving toward the tree line, every step taking him further from the only life he'd ever known. The weight of the supplies, the feel of free man's clothing on his body, the silver locket pressed against his chest, all of it felt surreal, like a dream from which he might wake at any moment. Behind him, the plantation slept peacefully, unaware that its carefully ordered world was about to be shattered. The main house stood silent and imposing, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight, like the pillars of a temple dedicated to human bondage. As he reached the edge of the woods, Thomas turned back for one last look at the main house. Isabella's window was dark now, but he knew she was there, watching, praying, hoping that her act of courage would lead to his freedom. The sight of that dark window filled him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for her sacrifice, sorrow for the danger she now faced. The forest welcomed him with shadows and whispered promises of sanctuary. Thomas pulled out the map, studying it by moonlight, memorizing the route to the creek and the landmarks that would guide him north. Then he set off toward the Rappahannock River, toward the ferryman named Josiah, toward a future that was no longer written by someone else's hand. Behind him, the Whitmore plantation continued its slumber, but the seeds of change had been planted. By morning, nothing would ever be the same. The rope hanging from Isabella's window would be discovered, the empty space in the slave quarters would be noted, and the careful order of Master Whitmore's world would begin to crumble. But for now, in the darkness of the Virginia night, Thomas walked free for the first time in his life, carrying with him the hopes and prayers of a young woman who had risked everything to give him a chance at the life every human being deserved. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Whitmore plantation, and with it came the discovery that would shake the foundations of everything Master Jonathan Whitmore believed about his ordered world. The morning mist clung to the fields like ghostly fingers, and the air carried the crisp promise of autumn's approach. The morning bell rang as usual at 5 o'clock sharp, its bronze voice calling the slaves to another day of labor. But when the overseers conducted their count, gathering the workers in the pre-dawn darkness to assign the day's tasks, one name went unanswered: Thomas. Overseer Briggs, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his efficiency, noticed the absence immediately. He had been managing slaves for over 20 years and prided himself on knowing every face, every name, every potential troublemaker in his charge. Thomas had always been a model worker, strong, reliable, never causing problems, which made his absence all the more suspicious. "Where's Thomas?" Briggs barked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a whip crack. The assembled slaves looked at each other with carefully neutral expressions, their faces masks of ignorance and concern. They had learned long ago that survival depended on seeing nothing, hearing nothing, knowing nothing when trouble arose. "Ain't seen him since yesterday evening," offered old Moses, his voice carefully modulated to suggest mild concern rather than knowledge. "Maybe he took sick in the night." But when Briggs and two other overseers searched Thomas's quarters, they found his sleeping space empty, his few possessions undisturbed. More telling still, they discovered that his work clothes, the rough cotton shirt and patched trousers that marked him as plantation property, had been left behind, folded neatly on his thin mattress. Isabella heard the commotion from her bedroom window as she dressed for breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons of her morning dress. Shouts echoed across the grounds as overseers searched the quarters, the stables, and every building on the plantation. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, but she forced her face into an expression of mild curiosity, the look of a young lady wondering about the unusual activity outside her window. By the time she reached the breakfast room, her father was already there, his face thunderous with rage. The rope of bedsheets had been discovered hanging from her window, and the implications were clear to anyone with eyes to see. Master Whitmore stood by the tall windows, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. "Isabella!" Master Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip, causing the crystal glasses on the sideboard to ring softly. "What do you know about this?" Isabella's hand flew to her throat in practiced shock, her eyes widening with what appeared to be genuine confusion and fear. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, preparing for the performance that might save her life. "Father, what's wrong? You're frightening me." Her voice carried just the right note of bewildered innocence, the tone of a sheltered young woman who couldn't possibly comprehend such serious matters. "That slave, Thomas, has escaped, and someone helped him. Someone in this house provided him with a rope made from bedsheets." His cold blue eyes bored into hers with the intensity of a man who had built his fortune on reading people's weaknesses and exploiting them. "Your bedsheets, daughter." "My bedsheets?" Isabella's voice rose in perfectly pitched confusion, her free hand gripping the back of a chair as if she needed support. "But how is that possible? I was asleep all night. I heard some strange noises, but I thought it was just the wind in the trees." Margaret Whitmore looked up from her morning laudanum dose, her dulled eyes struggling to focus on the conversation. The medicine that kept her emotional pain at bay also clouded her perception, making her slow to understand the gravity of the situation. "Jonathan, surely you don't suspect our Isabella of such a thing," Margaret said, her words slightly slurred. "She's just a child, barely 17. She wouldn't know the first thing about helping slaves escape." But Master Whitmore wasn't convinced. He had survived and prospered in a world where deception was common, where fortunes could be lost on a handshake and trust was a luxury few could afford. He studied his daughter's face with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to spot lies and weakness in business negotiations and slave auctions. "Strange noises, you say? What kind of noises?" His voice was deceptively calm, but Isabella could hear the steel beneath the surface. Isabella wrapped her arms around herself, playing the frightened young lady to perfection. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, just enough to suggest genuine fear without overplaying the emotion. "Scratching sounds like tree branches against the house, and once I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel, but when I looked out my window, I saw nothing but shadows. I was too frightened to investigate further." It was a masterful performance, but Thomas's escape had cost Master Whitmore money and pride, two things he valued above all else. A strong young slave like Thomas was worth at least $1,500, and the Hendersons had been expecting delivery today. More importantly, a successful escape would encourage other slaves to attempt the same, potentially costing him thousands more in lost property. He called for the overseer and the bloodhounds, determined to track down his missing property and make an example that would prevent future escapes. The dogs were brought from their kennels, massive, powerful animals bred specifically for tracking human scent. Their baying filled the morning air as they were led to Thomas's quarters to pick up his trail. Meanwhile, Thomas was miles away, following Isabella's carefully planned route through the Virginia wilderness. He had waded upstream through the creek for over a mile, the icy water numbing his feet, but hopefully breaking his scent trail as Isabella had instructed. The herbs and spices she had given him were scattered along his path, their strong scents designed to confuse the sensitive noses of tracking dogs. The map Isabella had given him proved invaluable, more detailed and accurate than anything he could have hoped for. She had marked not just the safe houses, but dangerous areas to avoid, towns known for aggressive slave catchers, plantations with particularly vigilant overseers, and roads frequently patrolled by authorities. She had noted the locations of streams where he could refill his water supply, caves where he could shelter during storms, and even the times when certain roads were most likely to be empty of traffic. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas found shelter in a dense thicket of brambles and undergrowth, exactly where Isabella's map indicated he would find cover. But sleep eluded him as he listened for the baying of bloodhounds that might signal his pursuers were closing in. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the call of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the wind, made his heart race with the possibility of discovery. Back at the plantation, the search was intensifying. Master Whitmore had called in professional slave catchers, hard men with harder reputations who made their living hunting human beings. These were specialists who understood the psychology of runaway slaves, who knew the routes they typically took and the mistakes they commonly made. The lead slave catcher, a gaunt man named Caldwell with pale eyes and scarred hands, studied the rope with professional interest. He examined the knots, tested the strength of the fabric, and noted the careful way the sheets had been tied together. "This wasn't done by the slave," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "These knots are too sophisticated, too well planned. Someone with education helped him, someone who knew what they were doing." Master Whitmore's suspicions returned immediately to his own household. He questioned every servant, every slave who worked in the main house, looking for the traitor who had helped Thomas escape. His interrogations were thorough and brutal, conducted in the basement of the main house where screams wouldn't carry to the neighbors. Sarah, Thomas's sister, endured particularly harsh questioning. She was brought before Master Whitmore in his study, where the morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated the maps and ledgers that represented his empire of human bondage. "Your brother has escaped," Whitmore said without preamble, his voice cold and precise. "Someone helped him. I want to know who." Sarah kept her eyes downcast in the submissive posture that had kept her alive this long. But inside her heart was breaking with worry for Thomas's safety and terror for her own future. "He never said nothing to me about running, Master," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas was always quiet, kept to himself mostly. I don't know nothing about how he got away." The young woman had learned well from years of survival in bondage. She revealed nothing, claiming ignorance of her brother's plans, while her heart broke with worry for his safety. But Whitmore wasn't satisfied with her answers. He had her taken to the quarters and confined under guard, a prisoner in her own home. The bloodhounds picked up Thomas's trail easily enough, their powerful noses following his scent from the slave quarters to the main house and then toward the woods. But at the creek, exactly as Isabella had predicted, the trail vanished in the running water. The slave catchers cursed and spread out along both banks, but Isabella's advice had served Thomas well. They found no trace of his passage. Caldwell studied the creek bank with growing frustration. In his 20 years of tracking runaway slaves, he had rarely encountered such a clean break in a scent trail. Most runaways were driven by panic and desperation, making mistakes that left obvious signs for experienced trackers to follow, but this escape showed signs of careful planning and expert knowledge. "Whoever helped him knew about the dogs," Caldwell told Master Whitmore when they returned to the plantation that evening. "They knew exactly how to break a scent trail. This wasn't luck, this was planning." As the day wore on and the search proved fruitless, Master Whitmore's suspicions returned to his own household with renewed intensity. He questioned every servant again, this time with threats and promises of reward for information. But the household staff, whether from ignorance or loyalty, revealed nothing useful. Isabella maintained her performance flawlessly throughout the day, even volunteering to help search her own room for clues. She gasped in apparent shock when they found a few threads caught on her windowsill, evidence of the rope's passage. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, pressing her hand to her chest in a gesture of feminine distress. "To think that savage was right outside my window. I could have been murdered in my sleep." But Master Whitmore's eyes remained cold and calculating as he watched his daughter's reactions. Something about her responses didn't ring true, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. There was a quality to her shock that seemed rehearsed, a precision to her emotions that suggested careful preparation. "You heard nothing else?" he pressed. "No voices? No sounds of struggle?" "Nothing, Father. I was so frightened by the strange noises that I hid under my covers and prayed for morning to come. I never imagined, Such a terrible thing was happening right outside my window. As night fell, Thomas reached the Rappahannock River, his legs aching from the long day's journey through dense forest and rough terrain. The ferryman Josiah was exactly where Isabella's map indicated, an elderly black man with knowing eyes and careful hands, operating a small ferry that carried travelers across the wide river. The mockingbird sings at midnight. Thomas whispered the code phrase Isabella had taught him, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. Josiah nodded slowly, his weathered face showing no surprise at the coded message. "And the owl answers with wisdom," he replied, completing the exchange. "You're the one Miss Isabella sent word about. Come quickly. We need to get you across before the patrols come through." The ferry ride was tense and silent, both men listening for sounds of pursuit. The river was wide and dark, its surface reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds. Thomas had never been on water before, and the gentle rocking of the boat made him dizzy with a mixture of fear and wonder. But they reached the far shore safely, and Josiah pointed Thomas toward a path that would lead to the next safe house. "You tell folks up north about Miss Isabella," Josiah said quietly, his voice filled with respect and admiration. "That young lady's got more courage than most grown men I know. She's been helping folks find freedom for near on a year now." Thomas's eyes widened in the darkness. Isabella's assistance hadn't been a one-time act of conscience. She had been systematically helping slaves escape, right under her father's nose. The courage required for such sustained resistance was almost incomprehensible. "How many?" Thomas asked, echoing the question he had posed to Isabella herself. "You're the seventh," Josiah replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. "And everyone made it to freedom, thanks to her planning and her maps. That girl's got the heart of a lion and the mind of a general." As Thomas disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward freedom, Josiah offered a silent prayer for the brave young woman who risked everything to help others find what she herself might never have: true liberty. Back at the Whitmore plantation, Isabella lay in her bed staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the candlelight. The rope was gone, the evidence destroyed, but she knew her father's suspicions were growing stronger with each passing hour. How long before he connected the dots? How long before her carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of his scrutiny? But as she thought of Thomas, hopefully safe and moving toward freedom, Isabella felt a peace she had never known before. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, she had struck a blow against the system that had shaped her entire life. 7 people now walked free because of her courage. 7 human beings who had been treated as property were now writing their own stories, choosing their own paths. The price of that freedom might be higher than she could afford to pay, but as Isabella finally drifted off to sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that it was a price worth paying. In her dreams, she saw Thomas reaching the north, finding work and safety, perhaps even finding a way to help his sister Sarah escape as well. In the distance, a mockingbird sang in the darkness, its voice carrying across the plantation like a promise that somewhere, somehow, freedom would always find a way. The sound was answered by the hoot of an owl, and then by the gentle whisper of wind through the trees, the eternal conversation of nature, indifferent to human bondage and human freedom alike. The night settled over the plantation like a blanket, but beneath its peaceful surface, the seeds of change continued to grow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities for courage. And in the darkness, the Underground Railroad continued its sacred work, carrying precious cargo toward the promised land of freedom. 3 months later. The letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by a traveling merchant who claimed to know nothing of its contents. Isabella found it slipped under her bedroom door, her name written in careful script across the envelope. Her heart raced as she recognized the deliberate handwriting. Someone had taken great care to disguise their natural penmanship, but she sensed the message was from Thomas. Inside, in painstaking letters that spoke of long hours spent learning to write by candlelight, were the words she had prayed to read. "Miss Isabella, the mockingbird has found its song in Philadelphia. Your courage gave wings to more than just one soul. Sarah sends her love from the house where we now work as free people. The locket bought passage for 2 more who needed help. Your sacrifice was not in vain. The seeds you planted continue to grow. Isabella held the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face as relief and joy washed over her in waves. They had made it. Both Thomas and Sarah were free, working and living as human beings rather than property. The letter didn't explain how Sarah had escaped. Such details would be too dangerous to commit to paper, but somehow, miraculously, both siblings had found their way to freedom. But the letter brought both joy and profound sorrow, for Isabella knew her time was running out. Her father's suspicions had grown stronger with each passing day, and she had been forced to suspend her underground activities. The risk had become too great, not just for herself, but for the entire network of people who depended on secrecy for their survival. Master Whitmore never did prove his daughter's involvement in Thomas's escape, but the seed of doubt had been planted deep in his mind. Isabella found herself watched more carefully, her movements monitored by servants who reported directly to her father, her correspondence scrutinized before it reached her hands. The freedom she had once taken for granted, the ability to move about the plantation, to visit the stables, to walk alone in the gardens, had been quietly but systematically curtailed. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. Her bedroom door, which had never been locked, now clicked shut each night with the sound of a key turning. Her window, once open to the night air and the songs of mockingbirds, was now secured with a new latch that could only be opened from the outside. Her father claimed these measures were for her protection, to prevent any other savages from threatening his precious daughter. But Isabella understood their true purpose. She had become a prisoner in her own home, her every action monitored and controlled. The books that had once filled her shelves, volumes of poetry, philosophy, and literature that had opened her mind to ideas of human dignity and freedom, had been quietly removed and replaced with more appropriate reading material, domestic guides, religious texts that supported slavery, and romantic novels that reinforced traditional gender roles. Yet despite the growing restrictions, Isabella felt no regret. 7 people now walked free because of her courage, and the knowledge that Thomas and Sarah were safe gave her strength to endure whatever consequences awaited her. She had discovered something precious about herself, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to choose what was right over what was safe. The autumn months passed slowly, each day bringing new evidence of her father's growing paranoia. He hired additional overseers, increased patrols around the plantation boundaries, and instituted new rules designed to prevent future escapes. The slave quarters were searched weekly for contraband, letters were intercepted and read, and any slave caught speaking to a member of the Whitmore family faced immediate punishment. Sarah's escape had been discovered within days of Thomas's letter arriving, though Isabella never learned the details of how her father's suspicions had been confirmed. The young woman had simply vanished one night, leaving behind only an empty bed and the whispered prayers of those who remained behind. Master Whitmore's rage had been terrible to behold. He had questioned every slave on the plantation, with a brutality that left several hospitalized and one permanently disabled. But no amount of violence could undo what had been done. The Underground Railroad had claimed another victory, and somewhere in the north, 2 siblings who had been born into bondage were learning what it meant to choose their own destiny. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the plantation in snow that seemed to muffle not just sound but hope itself. Isabella spent long hours at her secured window, watching the white landscape and thinking about the 7 people whose lives had been changed by her actions. She wondered if they thought of her, if they understood the price that had been paid for their freedom. The answer came in unexpected ways. A traveling preacher, invited to speak at the local church, included in his sermon a story about a young woman who had risked everything to help others find freedom. He spoke of courage and sacrifice, of the moral imperative to help those in bondage, and though he mentioned no names, Isabella felt his eyes find hers in the congregation. After the service, he pressed a small piece of paper into her hand, another letter, this one from Philadelphia. Miss Isabella, your courage has inspired others. The network grows stronger. Though you cannot act now, your example lights the way for others. 7 has become 17. The mockingbird song echoes far beyond Virginia. A friend, 17. Her actions had inspired others to join the cause, multiplying her impact far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. The knowledge filled her with a warmth that no winter cold could diminish. Spring brought changes that Isabella had both expected and dreaded. Her father announced her engagement to Charles Pemberton, the son of a neighboring plantation owner, a young man known for his cruelty to slaves and his unwavering support of the institution that had made both families wealthy. The marriage would unite two of the largest plantations in Virginia, creating an empire of human bondage that would span thousands of acres. "It's time you settled down and put aside these foolish notions," Master Whitmore told her as they sat in his study, surrounded by the maps and ledgers that represented his life's work. "Charles will make you a proper wife, and together you'll build something lasting." Isabella accepted the engagement with outward compliance but inward rebellion. She knew that marriage to Charles Pemberton would mean the end of any possibility of helping others escape. He would watch her even more carefully than her father, and his plantation was known for its brutal efficiency in preventing escapes. But even as she planned her wedding dress and received congratulations from neighbors who saw the match as advantageous, Isabella was planning something else entirely. If she could not continue her work from within the system, perhaps it was time to step outside it altogether. The idea came to her gradually, growing stronger with each passing day. She had helped 7 people escape to freedom. Why not make it 8? The routes she had memorized, the contacts she had cultivated, the methods she had perfected, all of it could serve her own escape as well as it had served others. The irony was not lost on her. A white woman of privilege choosing to abandon everything for the principle of human freedom was almost unthinkable in Virginia society. But Isabella had learned that some principles were worth any sacrifice, that some choices transcended social expectations and personal comfort. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to the institution of slavery, stories would be told of a young Virginia woman who had vanished on the eve of her wedding, leaving behind only a note that read, "I have gone to join those I helped find freedom. Do not look for me in the places where you would expect to find a lady. Look instead where justice calls and courage answers." Some said she had died in the attempt to reach the north, overcome by the hardships of a journey she was not prepared for. Others claimed she had made it safely to Philadelphia, where she worked with the Underground Railroad until the war made such work unnecessary. A few whispered that she had been seen in Canada, teaching freed slaves to read and write, her golden hair now gray, but her green eyes still burning with the fire of conviction. The truth, like so many truths about the Underground Railroad, remained hidden in the shadows of history. But in the slave quarters of Virginia plantations, in the safe houses of Pennsylvania, in the churches of Massachusetts, where abolitionists gathered to plan their next moves, the story was told and retold. The story of a young woman who had whispered 9 words that changed everything. "When all the lights go out, my window will be open." Some promises once made echo through eternity. Some acts of courage ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that reach shores the original actor never imagined. Isabella Whitmore had learned that freedom was not just about escaping physical bondage. It was about choosing to live according to one's deepest convictions, regardless of the cost. In the end, she had found her own freedom not in the comfort of privilege, but in the courage to risk everything for what she believed was right. And in that choice, she had discovered a truth that would outlast all the plantations, all the laws, all the systems built on human bondage, that the human spirit, once awakened to justice, cannot be contained by any chains. The mockingbird still sang in the Virginia night, its voice carrying across the years like a promise that somewhere, somehow, freedom would always find a way. And in that song, those who listened carefully could hear the echo of a young woman's whisper, a promise kept, a courage that had changed the world, one life at a time. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Isabella's position? What does true courage mean to you? Next week, we'll explore another incredible tale of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Until then, remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the world. This story is entirely fictional. While inspired by the real courage of Underground Railroad conductors and the countless unnamed heroes who risked everything, to help others find freedom. The characters of Isabella Whitmore, Thomas, Sarah, and the specific events described are products of imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This narrative was created to honor the memory of those who fought against slavery while telling an engaging story of courage and moral conviction.